Dr. Sarah Martinez had been working double shifts at the military hospital for 3 weeks straight. The petite surgeon, barely 5 feet tall, carried herself with the confidence of someone twice her size. At 34, she had already earned a reputation as one of the most skilled trauma surgeons on the base, but nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold on that scorching Tuesday afternoon in July. The call came in at 2:47 p.m. Incoming trauma, multiple casualties from IED explosion. The radio crackled through the emergency department. Sarah was finishing up paperwork from her previous surgery when the familiar surge of adrenaline kicked in. She quickly tied her long black hair into a tight bun and rushed to the trauma bay, her surgical clogs squeaking against the polished hospital floors. Within minutes, the helicopters arrived. The thunderous roar of the rotors filled the air as dust swirled around the landing pad. Sarah squinted through the chaos, watching as the medical team rushed toward the aircraft. Through the haze, she could see the stretchers being unloaded. 3 Marines, all in critical condition. The first Marine was conscious, but had severe shrapnel wounds to his legs. The second was unconscious with a head injury that would require immediate neurosurgery. But it was the third Marine that caught Sarah's attention. Lance Corporal Marcus Thompson, just 22 years old, had taken the brunt of the explosion while shielding his fellow Marines from the blast. As they wheeled him into the trauma bay, Sarah could see the extent of his injuries: multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and burns covering 30% of his body. His blood pressure was dropping rapidly, and his pulse was weak and irregular. The young Marine's face was barely recognizable under the bandages, but Sarah could see a small photo tucked into his vest pocket, a picture of a young woman with a bright smile, probably his girlfriend or wife. "What's his status?" Sarah asked the paramedic as they transferred him to the operating table. "Lost consciousness twice during transport. We've given him 2 units of blood, but he's still losing a lot. Heart rate is erratic, and we're having trouble maintaining his blood pressure," the paramedic replied, his voice strained with exhaustion. Sarah immediately began her assessment. Marcus's injuries were extensive: a ruptured spleen, multiple rib fractures with one puncturing his lung, severe burns on his arms and torso, and significant blood loss. But what worried her most was the internal bleeding that seemed to be coming from multiple sources. "We need to get him to OR3 immediately," she announced to her team. "Call anesthesia, and make sure we have at least 6 units of O-negative blood ready. This is going to be a long night." As they prepped Marcus for surgery, Sarah noticed something unusual about this young Marine. Despite his critical condition, there was a calmness about him during his brief moments of consciousness. He would squeeze her hand when she spoke to him, and even managed a weak smile when she promised him he was going to be okay. "Doctor, his family is here," a nurse informed her as they wheeled him toward the operating room. Sarah glanced toward the waiting area and saw an elderly couple, probably his parents, holding each other tightly, tears streaming down their faces. Standing beside them was the same young woman from the photograph, her hands clasped together in prayer. "Tell them we're doing everything we can," Sarah said softly, "and that their son is a hero." The surgery began at 4:15 p.m. Sarah and her team worked methodically, addressing each injury with precision and care. The ruptured spleen required immediate attention. They had to remove it entirely to stop the bleeding. Next, they repaired the punctured lung and set the fractured ribs. The burns would need specialized treatment, but for now they focused on the life-threatening injuries. Hours passed in the operating room. Sarah's team worked in perfect synchronization, each member knowing their role without needing direction. The anesthesiologist monitored Marcus's vital signs closely, adjusting medications as needed to keep him stable. The surgical nurses anticipated Sarah's every move, handing her instruments before she even asked for them. But as the surgery progressed, complications arose. Marcus's blood pressure kept dropping despite multiple transfusions, and they discovered additional internal bleeding that hadn't shown up on the initial scans. Sarah realized they were dealing with injuries far more complex than she had initially thought. "His heart rate is becoming irregular again," the anesthesiologist warned. "We might be looking at cardiac complications from the trauma." Sarah paused for a moment, looking down at the young Marine on her table. She thought about his family waiting outside, about the photo in his pocket, and about the fact that he had risked his life to save his fellow Marines. There was no way she was going to let him die on her watch. "We're not losing him," she said with determination. "Let's check for any missed bleeding sources and make sure we haven't overlooked anything." The team continued working, but Sarah could feel the exhaustion beginning to set in. She had been on her feet for nearly 18 hours, having started her shift early that morning to cover for a colleague. Her hands remained steady, but she could feel the fatigue creeping into her muscles. As they worked to stabilize Marcus, word spread throughout the hospital about the young Marine who had saved his comrades. Nurses and doctors who weren't directly involved in his care found reasons to pass by the operating room, offering silent support to Sarah and her team. The entire medical staff seemed to understand that this wasn't just another trauma case. This was about saving a true hero. By 9 p.m., the surgery had entered its 5th hour. Sarah's scrubs were soaked with sweat despite the cool temperature of the operating room. Her hands, usually rock steady, had developed a slight tremor from fatigue, but she pushed through, knowing that Marcus's life depended on her focus and skill. "Doctor, we're seeing some unusual bleeding near the liver," her surgical resident, Dr. James Chen, pointed out. "It looks like there might be a small tear we missed earlier." Sarah leaned in closer, her eyes straining under the bright surgical lights. The fatigue was making it harder to see the fine details, but she couldn't afford to make any mistakes. She had promised Marcus's family that she would do everything possible, and she intended to keep that promise. "You're right. Hand me the smaller retractor," she said, her voice slightly hoarse from hours of concentration. "We need to get better visualization of that area." As they worked to repair the liver laceration, Sarah noticed that her vision was becoming slightly blurry. She blinked several times, trying to clear her head. She hadn't eaten anything since breakfast over 12 hours ago, and had only taken one short break for water during the entire surgery. "Dr. Martinez, are you okay?" asked Lisa, the head surgical nurse who had worked with Sarah for years. She had noticed the slight change in Sarah's demeanor. "I'm fine," Sarah replied quickly, not wanting to show any weakness when Marcus needed her most. "Let's focus on stopping this bleeding." But Sarah wasn't fine. Her blood sugar was dropping, her body was dehydrated, and the adrenaline that had been sustaining her for hours was beginning to wear off. Still, she continued working, suturing the liver with meticulous care. "His vitals are improving," the anesthesiologist reported. "Blood pressure is stabilizing and his heart rhythm is looking better." For the first time in hours, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe they were finally turning the corner. Maybe Marcus would make it through this ordeal. But as she reached for another instrument, a wave of dizziness washed over her. "Doctor?" Dr. Chen noticed her hesitation. Sarah gripped the edge of the operating table, trying to steady herself. The room seemed to spin slightly, but she forced herself to continue. There were still several procedures left to complete, and Marcus wasn't out of danger yet. "His oxygen saturation is dropping," the anesthesiologist announced with concern. "We might have a problem with the lung repair." Sarah immediately refocused, pushing aside her physical discomfort. She examined the area where they had repaired Marcus's punctured lung and discovered that one of the sutures had loosened, causing a small air leak. This would require delicate work to fix without causing additional damage. "We need to re-repair this section," she said, her voice growing weaker. "But we have to be extremely careful not to damage the surrounding tissue." As Sarah worked on the lung repair, her hands began to shake more noticeably. The surgical team exchanged worried glances. But no one wanted to interrupt her during such a critical moment. They had all seen her work miracles before, and they trusted her judgment completely. The repair took another 2 hours. Sarah's movements became slower and more deliberate as she fought against her body's demands for rest. Several times she had to pause and take deep breaths to prevent herself from swaying on her feet. "Doctor, maybe you should take a break," Dr. Chen suggested gently. "I can take over for a few minutes while you rest." "No," Sarah said firmly. "I started this surgery and I'm going to finish it. Marcus deserves that." By midnight, they had successfully repaired all of Marcus's internal injuries. The bleeding had stopped, his lung was functioning properly, and his vital signs were finally stable. All that remained was to close the incisions and move him to the intensive care unit for recovery. Sarah began the closing procedures, but as she made the first suture, her vision suddenly became extremely blurry. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her sight, but the exhaustion was overwhelming her body's ability to function. "Dr. Martinez?" Lisa reached out to steady her. "I'm okay," Sarah whispered, but even as she said the words, she knew they weren't true. Her legs felt weak, and her head was pounding from dehydration and exhaustion. She managed to place 3 more sutures before the inevitable happened. As she reached for the next stitch, her body finally gave out. Sarah's eyes rolled back and she collapsed onto the operating room floor, her body hitting the sterile tiles with a dull thud. "Doctor down!" Dr. Chen shouted as he immediately stepped in to take over the closing procedure. "Someone call for medical assistance!" The surgical team sprang into action with the same precision they had shown during Marcus's surgery. While Dr. Chen and another surgeon finished closing Marcus's incisions, Lisa and 2 nurses attended to Sarah, checking her pulse and breathing. "She's conscious but extremely weak," Lisa reported. "Pulse is rapid, and she's showing signs of severe dehydration and exhaustion." They carefully moved Sarah to a nearby gurney and started an IV to replenish her fluids. Her eyes fluttered open, and the first thing she asked was, "How is Marcus?" "He's stable, doctor," Dr. Chen assured her as they wheeled her toward a recovery room. "You saved his life. The surgery was a complete success." Sarah tried to sit up, but the nurses gently pushed her back down. "You need to rest now," Lisa said firmly. "You've been working for over 20 hours straight. Your body needs time to recover." As they settled Sarah into a recovery room, word of what had happened spread quickly throughout the hospital. The story of the surgeon, who had literally worked until she collapsed while saving a Marine's life, touched everyone who heard it. Nurses, doctors, orderlies, and administrators all stopped by to check on her condition. Meanwhile, Marcus was transferred to the ICU, where his family waited anxiously. When Dr. Chen emerged from the operating room to update them, he could barely contain his emotion as he described Sarah's dedication and sacrifice. "Your son is going to make a full recovery," he told Marcus's parents and his girlfriend, Emma. "And it's because of Dr. Martinez. She refused to leave his side, even when her own body was shutting down from exhaustion. She literally gave everything she had to save him." Emma broke down in tears, overwhelmed by the thought that a stranger had sacrificed so much for the man she loved. Marcus's mother hugged Dr. Chen, whispering her gratitude through her tears. In her recovery room, Sarah drifted in and out of sleep, her body finally able to rest after the marathon surgery. She had no idea that her story was already spreading beyond the hospital walls, or that it would soon reach the highest levels of the Marine Corps command structure. The nurses monitoring her recovery were amazed by her dedication. Even in her weakened state, Sarah continued to ask about Marcus's condition every time she woke up. Her commitment to her patients' well-being extended far beyond the operating room. Sarah slowly opened her eyes to the soft morning light filtering through the hospital room windows. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure of where she was or how long she had been sleeping. As consciousness gradually returned, she remembered the surgery, Marcus, and her collapse in the operating room. "How long have I been out?" she asked weakly as Lisa, who had been sitting beside her bed reading a book, looked up with relief. "About 14 hours, Lisa replied with a gentle smile. "It's 8 a.m. on Wednesday morning. How are you feeling?" Sarah tried to sit up, but her body still felt heavy and weak. "Marcus? How is Marcus Thompson doing?" "He's doing wonderfully," Lisa assured her. "His vital signs have been stable all night, and he's showing excellent signs of recovery. Dr. Chen has been monitoring him closely, and all the repairs you made are holding perfectly." Relief washed over Sarah's face, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to truly smile. "Can I see him?" "The doctor wants you to rest a bit more first," Lisa said. "But there's something else you need to know. Word about what you did has spread throughout the entire base and beyond." Before Sarah could ask what she meant, a soft knock came at the door. Colonel Patricia Williams, the hospital commander, entered the room wearing her dress uniform, which seemed unusually formal for a routine visit. "Dr. Martinez," Colonel Williams said with deep respect in her voice. "How are you feeling?" "Much better, thank you. I'm ready to get back to work," Sarah replied, trying to project strength despite her obvious exhaustion. Colonel Williams smiled gently. "I'm afraid that's not going to happen today. In fact, I have specific orders to ensure you rest for at least 48 hours before returning to duty." "Orders? From whom?" Sarah asked, confused. "From the Commandant of the Marine Corps himself," the colonel replied. "Your actions yesterday have reached the highest levels of command, Doctor. What you did for Lance Corporal Thompson represents everything the Marine Corps stands for: honor, courage, and commitment." Sarah looked puzzled. "I just did my job. Any surgeon would have done the same thing." Colonel Williams shook her head. "No, Doctor. What you did went far beyond the call of duty. You literally worked until you collapsed, refusing to leave your patient's side even when your own health was at risk. That's not just medical excellence. That's heroism." As they spoke, Sarah became aware of a strange sound coming from outside her window. It was a low, rhythmic noise that she couldn't quite identify. Lisa noticed her confusion and moved toward the window. "Dr. Martinez," Lisa said with emotion in her voice, "I think you need to see this." Sarah looked questioningly at Colonel Williams, who nodded encouragingly. With Lisa's help, Sarah slowly got out of bed and walked over to the window. What she saw outside took her breath away. Spread across the entire courtyard of the medical center, standing in perfect formation, were hundreds of Marines in their dress blue uniforms, row upon row of them, all standing at attention, facing her window. The rhythmic sound she had heard was the collective breathing and slight movements of over 1,000 Marines standing in silent tribute. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "There are 1,100 Marines out there," Colonel Williams explained, her own voice thick with emotion. "They began gathering around midnight, just hours after word spread about what you did for Lance Corporal Thompson. They've been standing there all night, taking turns in shifts, maintaining a constant honor guard for you." Sarah's legs felt weak again, but this time it wasn't from exhaustion. "But why?" "I just did what any doctor would do." "You saved one of their own," Colonel Williams replied. "In the Marine Corps, we have a saying, 'No one left behind.' Yesterday, you proved that this principle extends beyond the battlefield. You refused to leave Marcus behind, even when it cost you your own health." Through the window, Sarah could see Marines of all ranks, young privates standing next to seasoned sergeants, officers alongside enlisted personnel. Some had tears in their eyes as they maintained their vigil. At the front of the formation, she noticed a group of Marines with bandages and crutches, other patients from the hospital who had insisted on joining the tribute despite their own injuries. "Lance Corporal Thompson woke up about 2 hours ago," Colonel Williams continued. "The first thing he asked about was whether you were okay. When we told him about your collapse and explained that you had saved his life, he broke down in tears. He asked if he could speak to all the Marines who had gathered, and what he said moved everyone to tears." "What did he say?" Sarah asked, wiping away her own tears. "He said that he had been prepared to give his life for his fellow Marines, but he never imagined that someone would be willing to give theirs for him. He called you the bravest person he had ever met and said that every Marine should aspire to your level of dedication and selflessness." As Sarah watched the incredible scene below, she noticed movement at the entrance to the courtyard. Marcus himself was being wheeled out in a wheelchair, accompanied by his family and Emma. Despite his obvious pain and the bandages covering much of his body, he had insisted on joining the tribute. When the Marines saw Marcus appear, a spontaneous and unprecedented thing happened. Without any command being given, every single Marine slowly and simultaneously raised their right hand in salute. The sight of 1,100 Marines saluting in perfect unison was breathtaking. Colonel Williams opened the window, and immediately Sarah could hear the sound of Marcus's voice, amplified by a small speaker so that everyone could hear. "Dr. Martinez," Marcus called out, his voice still weak but filled with emotion. "I know you probably can't hear me very well, but I wanted to thank you in front of all my brothers and sisters. You didn't just save my life yesterday, you showed us all what it means to serve others with complete dedication." He paused to catch his breath before continuing. "These Marines standing here represent something bigger than just gratitude. They represent respect for someone who embodies the very best of what we all strive to be." The Marines maintained their salute as Marcus finished speaking, and the silence that followed was profound and moving. Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was witnessing. "I need to go down there," she said suddenly. "I need to thank them." Colonel Williams smiled. "I thought you might say that. I have a wheelchair ready outside your room." A few minutes later, Sarah emerged from the hospital entrance in a wheelchair, wearing a hospital gown and robe, but sitting as tall and dignified as any Marine in formation. As she appeared, a sound unlike anything she had ever heard before filled the air. 1,100 Marines began a slow, thunderous applause that seemed to shake the very ground. The applause continued for several minutes as Sarah was wheeled to where Marcus waited. When she reached him, he took her hand in his bandaged ones. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he said simply. "Thank you for giving me the privilege of saving a true hero," she replied. The commanding general of the base stepped forward and presented Sarah with a special commendation on behalf of the entire Marine Corps. But more meaningful than any award was what happened next. One by one, every Marine in that formation approached Sarah and Marcus to shake their hands and express their gratitude. What began as a formal tribute became an emotional celebration of courage, dedication, and the unbreakable bonds that form between those who serve others. As the ceremony concluded and the Marines began to disperse, Sarah realized that this experience had changed her forever. She had always been dedicated to her patients, but now she understood the profound impact that one person's commitment to others could have on an entire community. Marcus made a full recovery over the following months, and he and Sarah developed a friendship that would last a lifetime. He often visited the hospital to check on her and to volunteer with other wounded veterans. Emma became like a daughter to Sarah, and Marcus's parents considered her part of their family. The story of the surgeon who collapsed from exhaustion while saving a Marine's life, and then woke to find 1,100 Marines honoring her sacrifice, spread far beyond the military base. It became a symbol of dedication and service that inspired people around the world. But for Sarah, the most important part of the entire experience was simple. Marcus Thompson went home to his family, and she had played a part in making that possible. That, more than any ceremony or recognition, was what made every moment of exhaustion worthwhile.